She blushed. In confession. You're my first. He took her hand. You'll be my last. The unforgiving prairie offered only two choices, dust or death. It was a sun-scorched land exuding desperation, isolation, and a profound despair that clung to a man like a shroud. Josiah Thorne knew both choices well. He pressed a blood-soaked hand to his side, stumbling through the sagebrush as he made tracks away from his past. Every ragged breath was a curse. The name Cutter was a razor in his memory, a debt that could only be paid in blood. His blood. He was a dead man walking a certified goner, and the world was starting to blur. He fell to his knees, strength finally deserting him. But then, through the heat shimmer, he saw it. A single flickering light in the distance. A homestead. A candle in the godless dark. He didn't know if it was salvation or simply a different kind of trap. But as darkness claimed him, he knew one thing for certain. His past had finally caught up, and it was about to knock on an innocent woman's door. The loneliness of twilight was a physical thing on the Caldwell homestead, a weight that settled in the vast open spaces between the windmill's groan and the whisper of wind through dry grass. It was a land that swallowed sounds whole, a land that demanded grit. Lillian Caldwell felt it every evening when she made her final round, a heavy Colt revolver, her father's last somber gift, strapped awkwardly to her hip. She moved from the chicken coop to the small barn, her gaze sweeping the horizon where the sky bled from bruised purple into the deep, final black of night. Dust. Wind. Silence. Her world had shrunk to these three constants. That was when she saw it. The flicker was gone. The darkness where Josiah had fallen was absolute again. But she had seen it. A trick of the light, perhaps. A dying ember from a lightning strike she hadn't noticed. But her heart, a frantic bird against her ribs, told her otherwise. Caution was the currency of survival out here, but something older, something more insistent, pulled her forward. She found him exactly where the last of his strength had failed him, a crumpled shape against the unforgiving earth. For a long moment she simply stood there, the cold metal of the Colt, a useless weight in her hand. A man. Down. Her first thought was an ambush, a trap set by some unseen evil. She should have run. She should have barricaded the door and waited for the merciless sun of morning. But she didn't. Hesitantly, she crept closer, her worn leather boots making no sound on the packed dirt. He was on his face, one arm flung out as if reaching for the memory of that distant light. His breathing was a shallow, ragged thing, a sound almost lost to the wind. She knelt, the smell of dust, sweat, and something metallic blood assaulting her senses. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she rolled him over. His face, even caked in grime and etched with pain, was starkly handsome, a roadmap of hard miles and harder choices. A dark stubble shadowed a firm jaw, and his lips were drawn back in a silent snarl. He was not a farmer. He was not a rancher. He was danger distilled into the form of a man. "Lord, what have you brought to my door?" She whispered, the words snatched away by the breeze. Getting him back to the cabin was a nightmare of dead weight and desperate grunting effort. He was heavier than a sack of feed, a solid, unyielding mass of muscle and bone. She dragged him, her arms screaming, her feet slipping in the loose gravel, the entire world shrinking to the few feet of ground between her and the blessed solid wood of her front door. Inside, the warm lamplight cast his harsh features in flickering relief. She laid him on her father's cot, the ropes groaning in protest. The wound in his side was ugly, a dark, weeping gash that had soaked his shirt in crimson. As she cut the fabric away, her hands trembled, but her movements were sure. She had tended to sick calves and injured horses. A man, she told herself, couldn't be so different. Yet he was. As she cleaned the wound with whiskey and hot water, his body tensed. A low groan escaped his lips. His eyes, squeezed shut, fluttered. He was a universe of pain, and she was a stranger trespassing in its darkest corners. "Hold still now," she murmured, her voice softer than she intended. "Just hold still. You're safe here." Was he? Was she? The question hung in the quiet room for hours as she sat vigil, watching the fever take him. He began to mutter his words, a broken slurry of English and what sounded like Spanish. Then his body went rigid. He thrashed his strong arms, flailing, and his eyes shot open, seeing not her, but a ghost from his past. Cutter. The name was a raw, strangled bark of pure hatred. No, not the ledger. The blood. Lillian froze, a cold dread seeping into her bones. Ledger blood. What kind of man was this? A bounty hunter. An outlaw. She backed away from the cot, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. This was it. The moment to run. But as he thrashed again, a wave of pure, agonizing vulnerability washed over his face. He looked like a lost boy trapped in a terrible dream. The hatred in his voice was matched only by the torment. Her fear warred with a sudden fierce wave of compassion. He was not a monster in this moment. He was a soul in hell. Slowly, deliberately, she came back to the cot. She dipped a cloth in cool water and gently placed it on his burning forehead. "Shh," she whispered, her own fear locked away behind a wall of newfound resolve. "You're not there anymore. You're here." He quieted under her touch, his ragged breathing evening out his body, finally sinking into a deep, exhausted sleep. Lillian did not sleep. She sat in her rocking chair, the Colt heavy in her lap, and watched him through the long, dark hours. The fever finally broke with the dawn, the gray light of morning revealing the sweat-sheened, peaceful lines of his face. He was going to live. The thought brought with it a terrifying, exhilarating wave of relief and a brand new kind of fear. Her world of dust, wind, and silence had been irrevocably broken. As the sun's first rays touched the windowsill, his eyes opened. They were not fevered or clouded. They were clear, sharp as flint, and they were fixed on her. He was awake, and he was watching her. The first thing Josiah Thorne knew was the scent. Not gunpowder, not cheap whiskey, not the coppery tang of fear. It was the clean, honest smell of wood smoke and drying lavender. It was the scent of a life he had never lived. He opened his eyes. The world came into focus slowly. Rough-hewn wooden beams overhead. A colorful patched quilt drawn up to his chest. And the woman. She sat in a rocking chair, bathed in the soft gray light of dawn, her father's heavy Colt resting across her lap. She was watching him, her expression a mixture of profound weariness and wary resolve. He had seen that look before in the eyes of homesteaders guarding their claim against a harsh winter or a pack of wolves. His body screamed as he tried to sit up, a fire igniting in his side. "Don't," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She didn't raise the gun, but she didn't lower it either. "You'll tear the stitches." He fell back, his breath hissing through his teeth. His mind, a weapon honed by years of survival, cataloged the room. One door, one window, one woman, one gun. He was trapped. But the ropes on the cot were soft, and the water she offered him from a tin cup was cool and clean. This was no prison. It was something far more dangerous. It was a kindness he did not deserve. "Where am I?" His voice was a raw, rusty thing. "My home," she answered, her eyes never leaving his. "You were hurt." "Who are you?" Lillian Caldwell. "And you," he hesitated. A name was a chain, a link to a past he was trying to outrun. But looking at the simple, unwavering honesty in her gaze, a lie felt like a profanity. "Josiah," he finally rasped. "Josiah Thorne." The days that followed were a strange, quiet truce. Josiah's body healed with the slow, grudging pace of a man who had abused it for too long. He began to walk first inside the small, clean cabin, then outside into the vast, sun-bleached emptiness of her world. He saw the strength in the careful lines of her mended fences, the hope in the tender green shoots of her garden. He watched her work from sunup to sundown, her small frame possessed of a resilience that shamed his own restless running soul. He started to help. He didn't ask. One morning he simply picked up an axe and began to split the woodpile, the rhythmic, percussive thud a balm to his fractured mind. He mended the leather on a horse's harness. He reinforced the latch on the barn door. Small acts of penance for a lifetime of taking. She watched him, her initial fear slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. She saw the way his hands, which she knew could wield a gun with deadly speed, could also be surprisingly gentle as he reset a loose stone in her hearth. One afternoon she found him staring at the Colt she'd left on the mantelpiece. "You know how to use one of those," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, his gaze distant. "Better than I ought to. Show me," she demanded, a sudden fire in her eyes. "If I'm to live out here alone, I need to be better than just clumsy." He took the gun, its weight familiar like a phantom limb. He showed her how to stand, how to brace her arm, how to line up the sights until the target, a distant tin can, was all that existed in the world. He stood behind her, his hand briefly covering hers to adjust her grip. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that felt both foreign and deeply craved. Her skin was soft. The scent of her hair was of sunshine and soap. For a moment the ghosts in his mind went silent. The shot was loud, kicking up dust far from the can. She flinched, disappointed. Again he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. She did, and this time the can jumped. A small triumphant smile touched her lips, and Josiah felt something shift inside him, a thawing around the edges of his frozen heart. That fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a man on a magnificent black stallion. He was dressed in a fine suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine a man who belonged in a city boardroom, not on the dusty plains. He dismounted with an air of ownership, his gaze sweeping over the small farm with a dismissive sneer. "Miss Caldwell?" he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He ignored Josiah completely. "Bartholomew Shaw. We spoke in town, you'll recall." Lillian's posture stiffened. "Mr. Shaw, I told you the farm is not for sale." Shaw chuckled, a condescending sound. "My dear, everything is for sale. It's simply a matter of price. I am here to make you a final generous offer before I am forced to exercise my legal options regarding the water rights your father so unwisely staked his claim upon." He produced a sheaf of papers, the official seals like daggers aimed at the heart of her homestead. "This land is too much for a woman to handle alone. It is a kindness, really." The threat, wrapped in the language of chivalry, was suffocating. Lillian's face went pale, her hands clenched at her sides. Desperation radiated from her, a silent, desperate cry that Josiah felt in his own gut. He had been a ghost here, a shadow healing in the corners. But seeing the predatory gleam in Shaw's eyes and the crumbling hope in hers, the ghost became a man. He stepped forward, moving between them. He said nothing. He simply stood there, his presence a sudden unmovable wall of stone. Shaw's eyes narrowed, finally acknowledging him. "And who is this?" "Your new farmhand," he sneered. "See that he packs your things for you, Miss Caldwell." With a final confident nod, Shaw mounted his horse and rode away, leaving his poison to hang in the air. Lillian stared after him, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "It's all I have left," she whispered. Josiah looked at her, at the fierce trembling line of her jaw. He looked at the small defiant garden, at the crooked but sturdy fences, at the humble cabin that had offered him sanctuary. He had spent a lifetime running from things. From the law, from his past, from himself. He turned, picked up the axe, and swung it. The blade bit deep into a log, splitting it with a clean, sharp crack. He swung again, and again. The rhythmic violence was a promise, a vow made in silence. Bartholomew Shaw was not taking this farm. He was not taking this woman. He was not taking this peace. Not while Josiah Thorne still had breath in his body. His running was over. The fight was just beginning. A fragile quiet settled over the homestead in the week that followed Shaw's visit, but the peace was gone. It had been replaced by a watchful tension, a silence that listened. The wind itself seemed to carry a warning. Lillian saw the change in Josiah. The quiet man who had healed by her hearth was gone, and in his place stood a guardian. He was a ghost at the edge of her property, his silhouette a constant presence against the bruised twilight. He'd walk the fence line every evening, his hand never far from the worn grip of his Colt, his eyes scanning the empty horizon as if expecting an army to rise from the dust. She felt safer than she ever had in her life, and she had never been more afraid. Who was this man whose gentleness was a thin veil over a core of hard-polished steel? The answer came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper of violence. She found it in the morning. The northern fence, the one Josiah had so meticulously repaired, was cut clean through. Not broken by a stray longhorn, but sliced with wire cutters. A message. The horses were spooked, their eyes wide and white in the dim light of the barn. Stay inside. Bar the door, Josiah commanded when she showed him. The voice was not the low rumble she had grown used to. It was the flat, cold command of a soldier. He didn't wait for a reply, simply took a rifle from the cabin and walked out toward the broken fence, melting into the landscape like a predator. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. She did as he said, sliding the heavy wooden bar across the door. But the silence of the cabin was a cage. She couldn't just wait. She crept to the small window at the back, the one overlooking the northern pasture, her knuckles white as she peered through the wavy glass. He was not alone. 3 riders sat on their horses by the distant cottonwoods, lazy and confident as if they owned the very air they breathed. One of them dismounted and walked forward to meet Josiah. Even from this distance, Lillian could feel the menace coiling off him, a stark contrast to Josiah's rigid stillness. The man was Josiah's dark reflection, tall and lean, but with a cruel swagger, a jagged scar tracing a line down his cheek. The wind carried their voices in broken, venomous scraps. She couldn't hear it all, but she heard enough. Playing Farmer Thorne, the scarred man's voice dripped with mocking amusement. The name Thorne hit her like a physical blow, a confirmation of a past he had never shared. Josiah's reply was a cold, hard sound she didn't recognize. "What do you want, Slade? Not a name, a weapon." The man named Slade let out a harsh laugh. "Prescott pays well, but old times, they're worth more." He gestured around the small farm. "This ain't you, Josiah. Dirt and chickens. You were born for gunpowder and gold. That life is over." "Is it?" Slade's voice turned sharp-cutting. Lillian pressed her ear closer to the glass, her breath held tight in her chest. "The price on your head says different, a fat bounty. More than this whole scrap of land is worth. I wonder what the pretty little homesteader would think of all that blood on your hands, all the men you put in the ground for a pouch of coin, or the hanging rope they got waiting for you back in Laredo. Bounty. Blood. Hanging rope." The words were stones dropped into the quiet well of her heart, sending sickening ripples through everything she had come to believe. The nightmare. The name he had screamed in his fever cutter. Was this him, Slade Cutter? It had to be. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of terrifying clarity. The man Josiah had sworn to protect her from was standing right in front of her. It was himself. Shaw just wants the land. Slade continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur she had to strain to hear. "I want you. Ride with me again. The old days. There's a bank and Dusty Fork just begging to be opened. Or I burn this place to the ground. And I tell the girl exactly what kind of snake she's let into her garden." Lillian felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She stumbled back from the window, a hand clamped over her mouth to keep from being sick. her protector, her quiet, gentle Josiah. He was a wanted man, a killer, one of them. She watched as Sladecutter and his men finally turned and rode away, their laughter a faint, cruel echo on the wind. Josiah stood alone for a long time, a solitary figure staring after them. His shoulders bowed under a weight she could now see was not weariness, but guilt. When he finally turned and started walking back toward the cabin, his face was a mask of grim resolve. Lillian watched him approach, her mind reeling. The man who had taught her to shoot, who had mended her fence, whose touch had felt like a promise, was a lie. He was a wolf she had mistaken for a sheepdog, and he was walking back to her door. The moment Josiah stepped back into the cabin, the air grew thick enough to choke on. The warm, comforting space had become a cage of silent accusation. He saw the truth in Lillian's eyes, clear and sharp as broken glass. She knew, or she thought she knew. Her fear was a palpable thing, a scent in the air stronger than the wood smoke. She flinched when he moved toward the water bucket, her hand instinctively going to the small pistol tucked in her apron. The trust they had built, fragile as a hummingbird's egg, lay shattered on the floor between them. He opened his mouth to speak, to forge a clumsy bridge of words across the chasm that had opened between them. It wasn't like that. I'm not that man anymore. But the words were ghosts dissolving before they could form. How could a killer, a man with a price on his head, speak of peace? His hands, which had so recently shown her how to hold a weapon, felt tainted, useless. Silence was his only answer. A grim, terrible admission. He did not need to tell her they were coming. She saw it in the way he moved, a fluid, deadly economy that had replaced the homesteader's patient rhythm. He checked his Colt, the soft click-click-click of the cylinder, a death knell for the quiet life he dared to dream of. He took the rifle from the wall. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his voice low and flat. "The root cellar," he said. "The door is thick oak. Don't open it. Not for any reason. Not until it's over." She stared at him, her face a pale mask in the dying light. For a heartbeat he saw a flash of defiance, a refusal to be ordered. But then she saw the figures cresting the hill, dark silhouettes against a sky painted in violent strokes of orange and red. She gave a small choked gasp and ran, disappearing down the trap door in the floor without a backward glance. The heavy thud of the door closing was the sound of a coffin lid sealing. He was alone. He had always been alone. The first shot came moments later, a high whining crack that splintered the window frame above his head. Glass rained down. They weren't waiting for the dark. They were arrogant, impatient. Josiah didn't return fire. He melted back into the shadows of the cabin, his mind a cold, clear engine of lethal calculus. The old instincts buried under weeks of honest labor rose to the surface. He was no longer Josiah, the mender of fences. He was Thorne, the man who survived, the man who ended things. But something was different. Beneath the ice-cold focus, a hot, terrible fear burned. Not for his life, for hers, for the small, fragile sanctuary she had built, now being torn apart by the wolves he had led to her door. He waited. Let them get closer. Let their confidence become a fatal mistake. A heavy boot kicked the front door, the wood groaning. "Thorne, we know you're in there. Shaw wants the girl alive. He didn't say anything about you." The voice belonged to one of Slade's men. Josiah smiled, a grim, humorless baring of teeth. He raised the rifle, aimed for a spot to the left of the door, and squeezed the trigger. The roar of the gun inside the small cabin was deafening. A scream from outside answered it, followed by a string of curses. Chaos erupted. Gunfire tore through the thin cabin walls, a hailstorm of lead that ripped through quilts and shattered crockery. Dust and splinters filled the air. Josiah moved low and fast, a phantom in the gun smoke, using the furniture for cover. He was a cornered animal, and he was in his element. He fired through the floorboards, taking out a second man who had crept onto the porch. 2 down. He knew he couldn't stay there. He slipped out the back window as two more men stormed the front and circled around to the barn, the place where he had taught Lillian to shoot. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. From the hayloft, he had a clear view. He saw Slade Cutter directing his men, his scarred face twisted in a furious grin. This was a game to him. "Burn it," Slade roared. "Smoke him out." A torch arced through the air, landing on the dry roof of the cabin. Flames licked at the shingles, hungry and fast. Lillian's home. A desperate rage, pure and clean, washed over Josiah. This was not for a bounty. This was not for survival. This was a reckoning. He took aim, the rifle settling against his shoulder like an old friend. He fired. One of Slade's men fell. He fired again. Another clutched his leg and went down. Then he saw Slade turn his pistol raised not toward the barn, but toward the ground, toward the root cellar. No, Josiah breathed. He dropped the rifle, drew his Colt, and launched himself from the hayloft landing in a jarring roll on the hard-packed earth. He came up firing. Slade spun, surprised by the sudden reckless assault. The world narrowed to the space between the two men, a 20-yard stretch of blood-soaked dirt. This was it. The ghost he could not outrun. "I knew you still had it in you," Slade yelled, firing wildly. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Josiah's shoulder, a hot, searing pain. He ignored it. "This isn't for money, Slade," Josiah growled, advancing his own shots, methodical, precise. 1, 2. Slade staggered, a look of shocked betrayal on his face. He clutched his chest, his pistol falling from his grasp. He looked at Josiah, a question in his dying eyes. Josiah gave him no answer. He watched his past collapse into the dust and die. The world went silent. The crackle of the burning roof was the only sound. The remaining outlaws had fled. He had won. He stumbled toward the cabin, his shoulders screaming, his body a landscape of new and old pains. He kicked open the trapdoor. Lillian. She was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with a terror that ripped his heart out. She was staring at him, at the smoking gun in his hand, at the blood on his shirt, at the cold, efficient killer who had just saved her life. He stood there, framed by the burning wreckage of her home, a monster silhouetted against the flames. He had protected her, and he had lost her in the very same breath. The silence that stretched between them was more devastating than any gunshot. Lillian climbed out of the root cellar into a world remade by fire and violence. The night air, once cool and clean, was now thick with the acrid stench of gunsmoke and burning pine, a funeral pyre for the life she had known. Her home, the steadfast cabin her father had built with his own two hands, was a roaring monster of orange flame, its walls collapsing inward, sending a shower of glowing embers into the star-dusted sky. Her world was ashes, and she was alive. She saw him then. Josiah. He stood near the barn, a solitary wounded sentinel amidst the chaos he had wrought. Blood stained his shoulder, his face was a mask of soot and grim exhaustion, and the pistol in his hand was still smoking. He was the storm that had passed the lightning that had struck the terrifying force that had saved her. Her body trembled a leaf in the wind. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide from the lethal predator who had worn a gentleman's face. But her feet were rooted to the spot. Her gaze was locked on him. He had not moved. He had not looked at her. He was staring into the flames as if watching his own soul burn. The sound of approaching wagons and shouting men broke the spell. The neighbors, led by the town marshal, had seen the blaze. They rode into the yard and stopped short, their faces a mixture of horror and awe at the scene before them. Bodies lay in the dust. The cabin was an inferno, and in the middle of it all stood one man, armed and bleeding. "Good Lord, Lillian," Marshal Thompson breathed, swinging down from his horse. "What happened here? Are you all right?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The marshal's eyes moved from the dead outlaws to Josiah, his expression hardening with suspicion. "That's Slade Cutter," another man said, pointing a trembling finger at the body near the cellar door. "Ran with the Red Creek gang. Carries a hefty price on his head." The men looked at Josiah differently then, not as a farmhand, but as something else. Something dangerous. Something to be feared. Josiah saw their looks. He saw the way they positioned themselves between him and Lillian. He was a pariah, a killer. He had saved her from the wolves only to become the new monster in their eyes. And in hers. While the marshal was distracted organizing a bucket brigade for a fire that was already a lost cause, Josiah moved. He didn't look at Lillian. He simply receded into the shadows of the barn, and when she looked again, he was gone. A profound, aching emptiness hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was not relief, she felt. It was loss. She stumbled toward the porch, the only part of the cabin not yet consumed by fire. There on the railing, held down by a smooth river stone he'd once given her, was a folded piece of paper. His handwriting was rough, slanted the words of a man not used to putting his thoughts on a page. "Lillian, they will tell you I am a bounty hunter, a man who traded lives for coin. They are right. The man you heard about Thorne was my name in that life. Slade Cutter was my partner. He was a ghost I could not outrun, and he followed me here. He brought my world to yours. I never wanted this. I never wanted you to see that part of me. The man who split your wood and fixed your fences was the man I wanted to be. The man who fought tonight was the man I am. I am sorry for the lies. I am sorry for the blood. I did not fight for the bounty on his head. I did not fight for my own life. I fought for yours. This peace, this place. It was the only good thing I had ever known. I could not let him poison it. But a man like me brings only trouble. My ghost will always find me. You are safe now because I am leaving. Don't look for me. J." She read it once, then twice. The paper trembled in her hand. The pieces of the puzzle that had tormented her, the nightmare, the name, the coldness in his eyes, all fell into place. But they did not form the image of a monster. They formed the image of a broken man trying to be whole. The violence she had witnessed was not the cruel act of a killer. It was the desperate final act of a protector. He had shielded her with the darkest part of himself. He had faced down his own damnation to save her. And she had looked at him with terror. She had let him walk away. A fierce, terrible clarity washed over her. It burned away her fear, leaving behind a pure, unyielding resolve. He thought he was a poison. He was wrong. He was the antidote to her loneliness, the wall against her fear. And she was not going to let him go. Without a word to the stunned onlookers, she ran to the barn. She threw a saddle on her most sure-footed mare, her hands working with a frantic, desperate speed. "Lillian, where are you going?" the marshal yelled. She swung herself into the saddle, her face set, her eyes blazing with a light he had never seen before. "I'm going to bring my home back," she said. She spurred the horse, galloping out of the ruined yard and into the pre-dawn gloom, following the fresh tracks that led away from everything she had ever known, and toward the only thing she knew she could not live without. She found him on the ridge overlooking the valley, a place a man goes to take one last look before disappearing forever. He stood beside his horse, a solitary figure ready to be swallowed by the wilderness. "Josiah." He turned his face a mask of shock and pain. "Lillian, you shouldn't have followed me." She slid from the saddle, walking toward him, her steps unwavering. "You don't get to decide what I should do," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "I read your letter. I saw what you did. I'm not afraid of the man you were." She stopped just before him, looking up into his haunted eyes. "I'm terrified of what my life will be without the man you are." "Lillian," he started, his voice breaking. "I bring death." "No," she whispered, reaching out and placing a hand on his chest right over his heart. You brought me back to life. Don't leave now. Don't run. Stay. And fight with me." Josiah stood on the ridge, a man caught between the wilderness he knew and the impossible sanctuary she offered. The wind whipped at his worn coat, the same cold, lonely wind that had been his only companion for a decade. He had waited for the bullet, the rope, the final bloody judgment of the world. He had never in all his dark imaginings prepared for this. For Grace. Lillian's words hung in the air, more powerful than any gunshot. Stay, and fight with me. She was not looking at a ghost. She was not looking at a killer. She was looking at him. "Lillian," he began, his voice a rough, broken thing. "You don't know what you're asking. The bounty, the men I know," she said, her voice unwavering, cutting through his self-loathing. "I know you fought to survive. I saw you fight to protect. That is the only fight that matters now. Our fight." He looked into her eyes, and for the first time he did not see the reflection of the frightened girl he had met. He saw a woman forged in fire, her will as strong and unyielding as the ancient rock beneath their feet. She was not offering him pity. She was offering him a home, a place to finally end his running. Slowly, like a man learning to walk again, he reached out and took the hand she offered. His calloused, blood-stained fingers closed around hers. He gave a single ragged nod. Their ride back was a journey through a world reborn. The sun crested the horizon, spilling gold, and rose across the wounded land, promising not to erase the scars but to warm them. The smoke still rising from the valley below was no longer a funeral pyre. It was a signal fire marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. They did not speak. There were no words for the chasm they had crossed. There was only the quiet, steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the warmth of her hand, which he did not let go. They returned to a scene of quiet industry. The marshal and the neighbors were already there, not as a posse but as a community. They saw Josiah and Lillian ride in together, and a silent collective understanding seemed to pass through them. No one asked about the bodies that had been carried away. No one asked about the price on his head. They saw the ruins of the cabin, and they saw the two figures who refused to be ruined. And they began to help. The rebuilding of the Caldwell homestead became the rebuilding of Josiah Thorne's soul. Men who had once eyed him with suspicion now worked alongside him, passing him lumber, sharing a dipper of cool water. Their silent acceptance was a more powerful balm than any medicine. He learned the language of construction, of raising beams and setting foundations, his hands learning to create instead of destroy. Lillian was the architect of it all, her quiet strength directing them, her vision of a new home rising from the ashes of the old. She was not just rebuilding a house. She was rebuilding a life, and she was making it clear in every stone laid and every nail driven that he was a part of it. The winter that followed was hard, but the new cabin's walls were strong, built on a foundation of shared resolve and the quiet respect of their neighbors. The seasons turned. The scarred earth of the yard sprouted new grass. The scent of gunpowder was replaced by the smell of baking bread and fresh-cut hay. One evening, a year to the day after the fire, Josiah stood with Lillian on the small porch of their new home. The setting sun bathed the valley in a gentle, forgiving light. The farm was quiet, alive. It was a piece he had once thought was a lie, a story for other men. Now it was the steady beat of his own heart. He was no longer a ghost. He was home. He turned to her, his heart full of words he had never known how to say. He had no ring, no worldly goods to offer her. He had only the truth. "Do you remember that first real day?" he asked, his voice low. After the fever broke, she smiled, a soft, knowing light in her eyes. "I remember." He took her hands in his touch now sure and steady. "You told me something then. You said I was your first." His throat grew tight with an emotion he could finally name. It was love, a fierce, protective, and profoundly humbling love. I've ridden a long, hard trail, Lillian. Seen a lot of beginnings and more than my share of bitter ends. I came to this place as a dead man. You were the first thing that ever made me want to live." He looked out at the land they had fought for, the home they had built, and then his gaze returned to her face, the only horizon that mattered now. "I'm making you a promise," he said, his voice thick with the weight of his vow. "I swear on this land, on this sky, and on my very soul, you will be my last."